Good morning and welcome to the City of Rapid City Planning Commission meeting for November 7th, 2019. If any member of the audience wishes to speak to an item on the Planning Commission agenda, there are speaker request forms along the table at the left wall. Please fill out the request with the agenda number of the item you wish to speak to and hand it to the staff seated on the left of the dais. At this time, we would also like to ask that if any member of the audience has a cell phone or other electronic device, that you either turn it off or turn the ringer to silent. If you need to take a call, please step out to the hallway so the meeting is not disrupted. Items 1 through 6 have been placed on the consent calendar and may be approved as a group today. Action will be taken on all consent items in accordance with staff's recommendation by a single vote. Any item may be removed from the consent calendar by any planning commissioner, staff member, or audience member for separate consideration. The findings of this planning commission are recommendations to the City Council. The City Council will make the final decision. Are there any items 1 through 6 that staff would like removed? Are there any items 1 through 6 that any planning commissioner would like removed? And are there any items 1 through 6 that any audience member would like removed for separate consideration? The chair would then entertain a motion to approve items 1 through 6 in accordance with staff's recommendation. All right, Rachel made the motion to approve items 1 through 6, and Karen seconded that motion. Any discussion on the motion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Item number 7.
Morning. Item number 7 is 19 PD 041. An initial plan development overlay to allow an apartment complex on property located at 1330 Catron Boulevard, approximately 10.82 acres in size. Start out with the overview. Currently the property is void of any structural development. Access to the property is across from Wellington Drive on the service road here. 10.82 acres in size. Zone medium density residential district with a plan development designation requiring the approval of a final plan development overlay prior to issuance of a building permit. The applicant's proposing to construct an apartment complex with 168 units. Future land use designation is low density neighborhood, but like I said, the property is zoned medium density residential district. And Catron Boulevard is identified as a principal arterial street, and there you can see where it's located in the area. We have some residential properties to the south. The applicant has held a public meeting for those neighbors and on Monday night, I believe, to get their input and show them what they're proposing. Here we have layout. This is Catron Boulevard. This direction would be north. We have 2 3-story apartment buildings and then 4 2-story buildings. The applicant's proposing a lot of amenities, including a clubhouse and dog walk area, swimming pool, grilling area, and a children's playground. The applicant is requesting 2 exceptions as part of this initial plan development. The first one is to reduce the number of parking lot landscape islands from 5 to 2. Those 2 are located here and here. The requirement is to provide landscaping within a parking lot to break up the paved area. These are going to be larger than the minimum or what is required with 2 or 5 total. So in those 2, there'll be the square footage for what it would be 5. And then we also have these smaller, not quite islands, they're peninsulas, so they don't count towards the requirement. However, they are also will be within that parking lot. Staff is recommending that the exception to reduce the number of landscape islands be approved. The second exception being requested is to waive the requirement that 50% of the landscaping be located within 20 feet of a parking lot. All the parking is located interior to the building, so there is limited area for that landscaping to be within 20 feet of the parking lot. In addition, the applicant has indicated that upon submittal of, and one of the stipulations of approval is that upon submittal of a final plan development, they'll provide a landscape plan identifying a buffer, a landscape buffer along the south lot line where that residential neighborhood in Catron Boulevard obviously is in that direction. But they'll be providing a landscape plan showing more bulk of their landscaping along that south property line. And so with the stipulation that they provide that landscape plan with the final plan development overlay, staff is recommending that that exception be granted. As I said, this is an initial plan development. They're seeking approval of the layout and design, and they'll still have to bring in a final plan development overlay. Two of the things you may notice, we don't have a landscape plan. That's not required with the initial plan development. In addition, a traffic impact study is not required with the submittal of an initial plan development. However, the applicant yesterday did submit a traffic impact study, so they'll be hopefully approved by the time the final plan development overlay is submitted. But I believe I'll have the applicant address what the traffic impact study says, but apparently it's a right turn lane in on Catron Boulevard would be what would be required with this phase. This is just another site plan showing the green space being included. So with 10.82 acres, there is a lot of open space, and they are meeting the requirement for usable open space, especially with the amenities being provided, the clubhouse, the dog walk area, and other green spaces. So with that, staff is recommending approval of the initial plan development overlay with stipulations. And I believe there are speaker request forms, but the applicant is also here and their consultant if there are any questions.
Thanks, Fletcher. Karen Bowman notified me that she will be recusing herself from this item. So, Mike Klosny?
I also will have to recuse myself.
Okay. And then we have a speaker request form from Mike Crane, Lloyd Companies. Sounds repetitive, but if you could identify yourself once you're at the mic.
Good morning. My name is Mike Crane. I'm the Director of Affordable Housing Development for the Lloyd Companies. I'm not going to go into, I think Fletcher did a great job of outlining the project that we're proposing here. I'm not going to go back and go through it all again. We're excited to be here, and I would think that the best thing that we could do today is maybe answer your questions. So I'll just step back unless there are questions, and we can go from there, if that's all right, Mr. Chair.
Okay, sounds good. I have one other speaker request form, but if anybody has any questions for Mr. Crane at this point or the applicant. All right, I'll call James Lettner then. Same deal, if you could identify yourself once you get to the microphone.
This one?
Yeah, that's fine. Do we have access to Rapid Map as well? Okay. Good morning, my name is James Lettner, 1204 West Boulevard. I own the property just to the west of this, and I guess we don't have Rapid Map, so I can't show you well what is going on. Oh, I'm sorry, I guess we do. So, the area highlighted in green is the property that we own. 10 years ago, I got a planned development for 240 apartment units on this parcel. And my concern is, and it might be very difficult to tell what's going on, but there's a hammerhead that serves the proposed development as well as our development. And I'm sorry I didn't realize that this would get to this point so quickly, and I just heard the tail end of what Fletcher was saying. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Fletcher. Can I use the pen? So this hammerhead is serving both their development as well as our 240 apartments. The layout that they've done here, it is perfectly obvious to me, and apparently a traffic impact study's been done, that this design is never in a million years going to work. This queue right here is about at most 4 or 5 vehicles. You're talking about in excess of 400 apartment units being on this single point of access, and that hasn't been addressed at this point. And in my opinion, it absolutely needs to, because it's going to hugely impact the way that this needs to be developed. And I mean, if it were something as simple as redoing our site plan and bringing this road through and putting a stop sign for those guys, I am fine with that. And I don't have a problem with them building apartments there. But what they're proposing is never going to work. It's never going to work with the planned development that we've already submitted. So I guess my request is that we hold off until we have a chance to study how their development and our development is going to access, in my opinion, a very poor design that's never going to functionally work for either them or for our property.
Thank you. Vicki?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Jim did secure an initial plan development approval for the apartments as he has identified. When this application came in and we indicated that it would trigger a traffic impact study, they realized the sensitivity of that neighborhood and offered to bring that in as quickly as possible. And it did get submitted before you heard it today. Unfortunately, it was submitted yesterday, but we have had a chance to look at the recommendation, and we probably need someone from the applicant's team there to stand up and speak to that traffic impact study. We did request that when they analyzed the movements in that intersection, that they take into account the previously approved apartments that came before the Planning Commission. That document is in our office, and can certainly make it available to Mr. Lettner so that he can take a look at that too. And this has been discussions that the applicant and staff have had with the state regarding Catron Boulevard, because that is a state highway at that point. So our recommendation today is, this is just initial. It's to get the exceptions checked off, similar to when Jim came in with just the initial to get his height exception on board. Now they can finalize their design, and that traffic impact study any recommendations that are coming forward would have to be incorporated into this design.
Thank you, Vicki. Any questions from staff or from the commission on this? Rachel?
I just wanted to give the applicant the opportunity to just kind of respond to that. I think it's a valid concern, traffic, but I would like to hear from you.
It is a valid concern, and as the planning director indicated, our engineers took into account the proposal that you approved for Mr. Lettner. They're suggesting that the connecting street from the access road to Catron be widened to include a left turn lane and an opportunity for right turn in order to move traffic in and out. They looked at the area not only as it will exist when we're done, but in the future, and determined that the intersection will never meet a warrant. The state warrants for a lighted intersection, a stop lighted intersection. I think we've taken it into account. As the director said, this is the initial development plan. This is a work in progress. We're continuing to define and refine things. We need the stipulations so that we know exactly what we're dealing with as we go forward, so that we're in a position to put this project in the ground come late spring of next year. So I would hope that we can get the initial approval, and we can continue to work with your staff and with the neighborhood in order to bring this project forward.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Vince?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to give you the same opportunity, and I heard what you had to say about the expanding the road and the turn lanes, the left and right turn lanes into the complex. I'd like to ask I'm sorry, our other speaker this morning, and the man from West Boulevard who owns the property west of this.
Mr. Lettner?
I'd like to ask you a question, if I may. Mr. Butler, you understand that this is a preliminary, and talking about the expansion of this lane, does that in fact help you in any way understanding what we're trying to do?
Well, it does, and things progress generally in a logical way. I haven't seen the traffic impact study, but what I can notice without being a traffic engineer, but having seen traffic problems and having a background in engineering, is that this is almost designed as a service road, that road may be going somewhere else and traffic can get in and off the road. What we have now is essentially 400 units coming to a single point, and then they feed onto another short road. I mean, this sounds crazy without something being up there, but if I could, Fletcher, can you put that back up for me? You're going to have roughly 240 apartments here, 160 apartments here. These 240 vehicles are going to be coming to this point. These 168 vehicles are going to be coming to this point. Those two traffic patterns are they're going to have to get here, and then they're going to have to go either east or west on Catron Boulevard. That is all that I know at this point, and I've shared with you what I know. They've done a traffic impact study. I'm excited to see it. My concern is that we were moving too far along in the development process without going after the very, very, very low-hanging fruit, which, in my opinion, is going to be this. That queue is nowhere near going to be long enough to manage the traffic from the proposed development in these areas. There's another issue, and it has to do, and maybe you guys have addressed this, and I don't want to get off on a tangent, and maybe it's not relevant to this discussion because I know that things are piecemeal, but as part of the infrastructure design criteria, only 40 housing units can be on one point of access. And we have got one point of access, and we are proposing close to 400 housing units. To me, those two issues need to be resolved before they or I or anyone spends an enormous amount of time and money on this project, because they are going to hugely impact our future tenants.
Yes, sir, I understand. Okay, thank you. I do appreciate you clearing that up for me. I'm done.
Galen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I do appreciate all the discussion on traffic today, but again, the task at hand is really we're talking about the parking islands and the landscaping exception. So, I mean, for that reason, I'm going to support this today. I do have a question on that service road parcel. If you can pull up that rapid map again, Fletcher. And that's actually part of that parcel is actually part of the right-of-way, correct? It's not. One of the
Yeah, it's in the right-of-way.
The zoning map was still yellow, so it made it kind of look like it was low-density residential, but that's actually part of the right-of-way. So if we parking or the traffic study were to say that we needed to expand that, whose responsibility with that? Is that state highway, or whose responsibility is that?
Vicki?
So if the requirement is needed to service this development, then it's the developer's responsibility if it's needed to serve them. And that's a part of what the state is looking at as well with this traffic impact study. And that was constructed by the state and is a part of the state highway system.
Okay. So would it be since it services really two developments, would it be a kind of a shared responsibility between the two adjacent owners, or do we have any, I mean, this is again getting farther down, farther ahead of us than what we really need to decide on today, but that would be a shared responsibility between the two developers.
Mr. Chair?
Vicki, please.
So in the past, it's whoever needs it first. If they're going to be held up in order for the adjacent property owner to participate, then in all likelihood, whatever improvements are needed, like widening that approach and putting in turn lanes, they'll be providing that in order for their project to go forward. And that's typically what we see happen.
Okay. And thanks for that information. And as I said, the task at hand is looking at parking islands and landscaping, so I'll make a motion to approve this initial plan development per staff recommendations.
Okay, Galen made the motion to approve the initial plan development overlay, and Rachel seconded that motion. Is there any discussion on the motion? Being none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. I apologize, my paper agenda in front of me is the accessory dwelling now the next unit? Okay, number 8, item number 8.
Good morning, Sarah Hansel, Long Range Planning Division. Item number 8 is 1908-007. This is an ordinance amendment to allow for accessory dwelling units in residential districts by amending Title 17 of the Rapid City Municipal Code. This is an ordinance that's come to the Planning Commission before. It was approved by the Planning Commission last year. When it went to council, the decision was made to spend a little bit more time on it, have some more work sessions with the city council members, have an additional open house, and make some refining language to the ordinance. Since that time, the city has also adopted an affordable housing policy as well. So those things have occurred, and so today we have this item back on the agenda. We just have a few overview slides to talk about what is in the ordinance. Some of this may be sort of a reminder for those of you who have seen it before. But just as an introduction, an accessory dwelling unit is a dwelling unit that has its own eating, sleeping, and sanitation facilities. We are defining ADUs to also require that they have a permanent foundation. You also hear these units referred to as granny flats, mother-in-law units, backyard cottages. You hear them referred to very many different ways. Here's just a sample of accessory dwelling units that do not exist. I'm sorry. Thank you. Sorry about that, guys. Some examples of accessory dwelling units that are not located in Rapid City but kind of illustrate what they look like. They can either be attached to the primary structure, detached, be constructed in an attic or above a garage. What's important to note about accessory dwelling units in Rapid City currently is that they do exist and they're not currently expressly permitted by our zoning code, which means that if you're someone who has an accessory dwelling unit on your property, perhaps it's existed since the property was built in the 50s or before, you're not legally able to rent that out. And so what we'd like to do with this ordinance is create a pathway for these units to become legal, for them to become acknowledged by the city, and also to create an opportunity for more of them actually to be developed. This is one strategy among many that the city can take to start to improve housing conditions. When we look at our comprehensive plan, there are a few different ways that this ordinance fits in with our goals for the community. Chapter 3 talks about expanding housing variety. It talks about making more efficient use of existing infrastructure, and really looking at how we can make our growth pattern more compact. And accessory dwelling units are one way that we can start to add more units in sort of a small way within existing and new neighborhoods. The action plan for Plan Rapid City specifically recommends that we take a look at accessory dwelling units as a form of housing that can meet demand from students and seasonal tourism workers, and they can also provide an income source for homeowners. The comprehensive plan goes on to say in the zoning diagnosis that we should be removing barriers to housing diversity, and by allowing ADUs, that's one way that we can do that. This is the resolution I mentioned earlier that the City Council adopted in September. where the city will pursue providing as many practical and necessary strategies as possible to promote affordable housing situations. And while we know that, not all accessory dwelling units will be in an affordable category in terms of rent. You can look at different definitions for affordable housing. We can look at our area and median income and then take 30% of that. We're not requiring that these units have those affordable designations, but we do know that as we add more units to the market, that's an important way to help in small steps, taking small steps. So as far as housing policy, like I mentioned, the City Council adopted that resolution to try to pursue as many angles as we can to help with housing. We know that they're a versatile type of housing. Over their lifespan, they may be used in different ways. You could have a young family that rents out an ADU to another group or to an individual. Then maybe several years later, they want to put their parents there as their kids are starting to age. You get that sort of multi-generational living, and that's a really great thing for communities and neighborhoods. You can even have as the primary owners continue to age and go on through their life cycle, they want to live in the smaller unit as they downsize, and maybe they want to rent out the primary structure. So these units can be used in a lot of different ways over time. We are recommending that the accessory dwelling units be allowed in residential districts with some criteria, which I'll go through in a little bit more detail. But here's a map of the zoning districts, including general ag, park forest. However, we expect most of these to be in low-density residential, and then to some extent medium and high-density residential districts. So here's a brief look at the criteria. First of all, this is the definition, which I mentioned earlier. These units must have their own sleeping and sanitation facilities, and they must be on a permanent foundation. So we're not talking about RVs in the backyard. Occupancy. This is a big item that came up when we had our public open houses, when we had our neighborhood meetings, when we had our work session with council, when we went on the radio to talk about this, and we've been on TV to talk about this. This is something that's been important to our community, that the primary owner is somewhere on the site. They're either in the primary structure or they're in the accessory structure. Not all communities regulate ADUs this way, but this is seen as something that, as we introduce these in Rapid City, this is important. I talked about this earlier. Residential districts, we want to encourage them in all neighborhoods. We're not saying that there's certain neighborhoods where these are appropriate and others where they aren't. However, there are certain site characteristics that we will need to take into account on a context case-by-case basis. So for example, if you're in the West Boulevard neighborhood district and you need substantial modifications to your historic home in order to do this, we're going to look at that. Maybe that's not appropriate for a contributing structure in the historic district. If you have a home on an existing small lot over in the Old Canyon Lake area where those roads were not built to city standards, maybe that's not an area that can accommodate. So we do have an ability to kind of look at this on a case-by-case basis, but we are saying starting out, we want to make these opportunities available in all zoning districts that are residential. Here's an overview of the area regulations that are addressed in the ordinance. First of all, detached units may not be in the front yard. That will help kind of keep the sort of single-family character consistent. And lot coverage may not be exceeded from whatever the underlying zoning district is. So you have 30% lot coverage, generally speaking. This ordinance doesn't impact that. You still have to stay within that lot coverage or request a variance as you would for any other development application. And a detached unit cannot be more than 10% of the lot area. If you have a detached unit, it must be smaller than the primary structure. And if you do have a lot that's existing today already that is less than our current minimum of 6,500 square feet, then your ADU cannot be detached. It must be internal to the unit or attached. We do have a provision in the ordinance that allows us to start to look at residential character. If the ADU is greater than 500 square feet, we're saying it needs to have a residential appearance. We kind of went back and forth on this several times. How much detail do we really need to put in that? Some communities will say you have to match the character of the existing house. Well, maybe the existing house doesn't have that strong character anyways. What we're really looking at is how does the roof pitch fit in with the neighborhood? What are the window patterns like? Basically, does this look like it fits in generally? This may be something we can come back and look at over time if we need to make some adjustments. Parking is addressed in this ordinance. We are requiring one dedicated parking spot for the accessory dwelling unit that is off-street. That is in addition to the 2 that are already required for the primary structure. And then, we know that there's a lot of these that already exist today. How are we handling any nonconformities with existing city codes? We're saying that once you register, we're going to kind of acknowledge that you may have some nonconformities to existing codes or ordinances. Once you register, that's okay, but when you do come in for a permit for remodeling or reconstruction in the future, that's when you need to bring your unit up to code for any items that you might be changing. If you're getting an electrical permit, then you need to get the electrical up to code. And of course, the procedures for historic preservation will apply in historic districts. We have a section in this ordinance that addresses short-term rental. So as most of you are probably aware, at the same time as we've been working on this, we also have a draft short-term rental ordinance. Similar to ADUs, short-term rentals are not currently sort of expressly addressed in our code. So what we're saying in this ordinance is that if you register under our ADU process, you can use your unit for renting situations that are greater than 28 days. Very soon in the future, we'd like to bring forward a short-term rental ordinance that will look at how short-term units would be addressed separately. So as it stands today, if you have an ADU, it's to be used for living purposes only. I'm sorry, living like longer than 28-day rentals. And then I mentioned there's some basic criteria for existing ADUs. Basically, you have to meet the definition, have those separate eating, sleeping, sanitation facilities. You have to be owner-occupied. You have to be in a residential zoning district. You may only have one on your property, and you have to meet the parking. But beyond that, if your lot size doesn't meet current standards, if your lot coverage doesn't meet current standards, your building height or setbacks or some issues like that, we're kind of granting a pass at those for the existing units in order to make it feasible for people to register. The registration will involve submitting a site plan and a floor plan to the Community Development Department, demonstrating that you meet the requirements in Section O, and then potentially paying a fee which would be set by resolution by the City Council. This hasn't been determined yet, but if this ordinance continues to go forward, the discussions have been that it would be a relatively small fee. We're not trying to create a huge barrier. We want people to register their unit, so maybe $50, $100, somewhere in that range is kind of how the discussions have been going. Then you have 2 years to register, and if you don't, then the city can pursue action under Section 1.12.010. This is just kind of an overview of the FAQs. We've kind of talked through all of the criteria, though. With that, I will take it open for any questions. We are recommending to approve this ordinance.
Thank you, Sarah. Lights are starting to show up, so get ready. Mike Quasney.
I struggle with a couple things on these ADUs. If I'm a young family and I have somebody that's going to help meet my payment by, i.e., I've got a friend that moves in downstairs, are we controlling that?
No.
Okay. At any point, can that happen where it determines, well, it is the same as an ADU and so it should be? And I guess I struggle that I could see that going down that road.
Vicki?
Thank you. So currently, we've got a definition for family that says that, of course, anyone that is your family, you could have a family with 10 children, but you can have 5 unrelated individuals in your home and constitute a family. So we do regulate that to some extent. We wouldn't want a 6-bedroom home turning into a frat house, as an example. So I could rent my 3 extra bedrooms out to anyone as long as I don't have more than 5 of us living on the property. So your scenario, where maybe you have an ADU in your basement, but you've got an extra bedroom in the main part of the home, and you wanted to rent it out to a friend or let a friend stay, they would just be a part of your family, whereas then the ADU would fall within these regulations.
Okay. Then the rally's coming. I've got 6 people that I have known for years, and I rent out to them. Is this in any way adjusting to that?
No, it was that provision in state law about the 2-week rental is still in place, correct, Wade? Okay, yeah, by state law, you can rent out any part or portion of your property for up to 2 weeks without any need to get a business license or any other kind of.
So at a week and a half, I put the fish on the table and I let it rot and I tell them it's time to go. Okay. That is some of the stuff that I struggle with. It feels as if there's, I don't want to get it to where we're controlling, the city government, state government, federal government is controlling what I can do with my home. And it feels kind of that way. And I struggle a little bit with the concept. So that's what I struggle with. Thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Vicki?
Mike, we really do appreciate those comments, and I'm just going to challenge you to look at it this way. So the fact that you can rent your bedrooms out and you can have your whole family there, and if you wanted to rent out up to 5 people that are unrelated to you, that's in place today. What we're trying to do is allow you more use on that property, not reduce that use. And the accessory dwelling unit allows you to do that. It brings you that financial assistance for whatever purpose you may need it. Or potentially it's just bringing family members, like your parents, to your property that want to live independently. So I think it's expanding the uses of your single-family home.
I appreciate that. She just made comment to the fact that you might want to, and then you might want to bring your parents in, and then it just felt like we're heading that way, and oftentimes it starts out as a simple thing, and it turns into we're going to control everything you do, is what it feels. And I struggle with that part of it, that it's my home, and if I want to bring somebody in, it seems like I should have that ability to do so. Now, I understand traffic, I understand parking, I understand all that stuff, but I just don't know that I'm a fan of too much control.
Thanks, Mike. Eric?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just had a question concerning the permanent foundation. In light of the fact that many tiny home communities are developing, and the fact that most of your tiny homes are built on a trailer with wheels, how will you address that in terms of are they going to be allowed if they're on a trailer versus on a permanent foundation?
They would only be allowed if they are on a permanent foundation.
Okay.
So even if they come manufactured with the option of the movable wheels, our ordinance is requiring that you make it a permanent part of that property on a foundation.
Okay, so skirting wouldn't accomplish that, or?
Nope, it must be a foundation.
Okay, thank you.
Rachel?
Okay, this is going to sound a little bit off the wall. You know how much I support this, but I was reading the ordinance again last night. And I looked up the definition of dwelling unit, and that makes sense. But then I looked up the definition of dwelling itself, and it says a building or portion thereof exclusive of mobile homes as defined, used for residential purposes. So then I was looking at section P of this proposed ordinance, and it says any person owning an existing accessory dwelling unit that has not previously been registered with the city, and then continues. And I just wanted to make sure that it's not simply owning the property or creating the property, but it's actually using it as a dwelling unit or the intent to use as a dwelling unit. So I just want to make sure that that's what we're voting on, and we're not actually going to penalize people or require registration of a property that you know, is in existence but is not actually being used as a dwelling unit. Is that?
Good question. Vicki?
So you're right. If they're not using that unit as an accessory dwelling unit, but it's just an expanded part of their residence, and that's where the teenagers are living. A lot of us, I think, shove those kids down to that basement that could function as an apartment, then no, they would not have to register. It's just for the allowance of creating that income property on site with the owner of the property being in either the main structure or the ADU.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just had this moment last night where I was like, oh my goodness, did I misunderstand part of this ordinance? So thank you for answering.
John?
I don't see anything in here about you can do this providing your subdivision doesn't have restrictions against it. Where's that wording?
Mr. Chair?
Vicki?
Potentially, we could have Wade speak to the city's ability to enforce or recognize covenants.
All right, Wade, you're on the spot now.
Gladly. Generally, we don't enforce covenants. There's a number of reasons for that. Probably first and foremost is the fact that we're not set up to basically arbitrate or decide a dispute between two neighbors when it's over a legal document like that. So we're not set up to be a court that can look at how was this executed, was it recorded in the right way, was there notice given, was there any other problem with it. These are a lot of things that when people challenge covenants, they say, the developer did this after I bought my property, or they did something wrong in the process. So if somebody came and said, I have these covenants on my property or on the whole neighborhood, the subdivision, don't let them do this, then we have to look at this set of covenants and say, does it say what you say it is really in there? We have to interpret it to say, this is what that covenant means. The language of it means that you can only, some things are like, you can only paint your house brown. That's pretty self-explanatory, but there are a lot of other issues that are left up to interpretation or discretion. And so that makes it tough for us to come in and have to basically arbitrate a dispute, between two people. And so that's kind of one of the reasons that we don't enforce covenants. The other thing is that we set up our own zoning rules, and we say you can have this type of use, you need to have this setback, and we make our own code, and that's what our code enforcement, that's what our attorneys, that's what we do, is we enforce our code as opposed to contracts between individuals. So I guess those are the two main reasons that we don't get into enforcing covenants.
So if the covenant says we do not allow any portion of this property to be rented out or have a commercial use, you guys couldn't figure that out? That's pretty plain. That's like brown.
True, but we're still not equipped to handle the dispute between two neighbors. We have our code that says this is zoned for commercial use. And so if you want to put a commercial use on there, we'll approve it. That doesn't mean that you're not subject to a lawsuit from the people who can enforce the covenant. So that's just the thing, is we don't have the ability to enforce that. We sort of, even if we said, no, you can't do that, if we have a zoning ordinance that says you can do commercial and they want a commercial building permit and we won't give it to them, they'll come in and say, the city has no right to deny this because I meet the zoning requirements. And they'd be right. So we could end up in court and we would lose. So we'd issue a building permit and then they would be sued by their neighborhood. And we don't necessarily have the ability to say, even though you meet our zoning code, you have this agreement with your neighbor. So we have to insert ourselves into that. So that's the reason we don't enforce covenants, is we stay out of those private agreements.
The other thing, I firmly believe these should have conditional use permits. If someone's coming in to do this, they're doing it for financial gain. Okay? And if that being the case, they can spend the money so it can be inspected Everything that they put on that application can be verified, and then if there's any kind of an issue, it's all here. We have it. This way, they're going to come in and give a piece of paper with a plot plan on it, say, here's all the stuff, here's your $100 or whatever. But we don't know if it meets that. Plus, there's no notification of the immediate neighbors. One day, we're going to just say, yeah, everybody in town can do this. No. Then the neighbors are going, wait a minute, we got extra people living in this house. And there's a lot of them on their own private water systems, which weren't designed for 2 families on 1 lot. How are we going to deal with that?
I think that's something that staff's taken into account, and I defer to Vicki, I guess. We've kind of been through those discussions. You could maybe...
Vicki?
John, that is really great comments. Years ago, we kind of approached home occupations that way. And you have to meet 15 conditions in order to do a home occupation. And originally, they were required to come forward to the Planning Commission, and even back then, before the City Council, to be reviewed as a conditional use permit. And it was just routinely approve, approve, approve. Why? Because they couldn't submit if they didn't meet all 15 criteria. And we are, if you've come in for a building permit or you've submitted that site plan, we've got a list of what it must include, and it must include it. When we look at the accessory dwelling units, what Sarah has spelt out today is that the location, the size, the design, how they're used, who has to occupy the property, and the parking is spelt out in the ordinance. There's nothing more we would review as a part of a conditional use permit, which is different than, let's say, if you're a car wash. There are some locations that may be appropriate, some where it won't be appropriate because of residential impact. That's where the conditional use aspect falls into place, is when that specific use may not be appropriate, not that the neighbors don't like it, but that just the adjacent land use doesn't support it. And in this case, if you're in a residential neighborhood and it's determined that you meet all of that criteria as Sarah described, then with those issues resolved, what's good for one neighborhood is good for another, as long as it maintains being operated in compliance with the stipulations set forth. That's why in this ordinance, if we did get complaints, someone was renting to 2 college kids and they had friends over and parking was a nightmare, they can file a complaint. Our director has the authority in this ordinance to suspend the license, the registration, and ultimately we can revoke it. So that is why we came to the decision that if this is going to be allowed, it shouldn't be based on whether or not the neighbor likes it. It should be based on whether or not it's being designed and operated so that it doesn't create a nuisance to the neighborhood.
I got to jump in with a follow-up here. I'm going to take a little license. So if a liquor license is a conditional use, right, and it follows the operator, not necessarily the building, this is not being a conditional use, it's on the property. So if this passes and there's an ADU on a property and the property changes hands, the ADU is still, does the new owner have to come in and say, I am going to continue to operate this in the fashion that it was originally applied for, or is it just, can it be sold essentially? You know, where it's just listed has an ADU, you know, extra income potential.
So as long as it is operated in compliance with the ordinance, the new owner would not need to come in and file on that property. That stays with that property, similar to the example I gave. On-sale liquor is a little different because there's a background check.
Yeah.
But if you get a conditional use permit for, let's go again to the car wash, and someone builds the car wash, they can sell that property as a car wash, and the new guy that's looking at buying it doesn't have to think, gee, I don't know, I need to go get my own CUP. As long as they operated in compliance with what the Planning Commission approved, then that stays with the property. And that, again, trying to ensure that we are not putting encumbrances where they're not needed. If they operate in line, then it should be permitted, and we can always fall back on if someone bought it new and they weren't living there, and it became an issue for the neighborhood, our director has the ability to suspend or revoke that.
One more follow-up, and I think you and the rest of the staff have obviously put a lot of thought into this. One issue we hear a lot of times, at least used to hear, I think it's finally subsiding, is historic districts. Well, I didn't know it was historic. Nobody told me it was historic. Do you anticipate an issue with that? I mean, is it kind of the same answer that if somebody isn't told the rules behind operating an ADU properly, do you anticipate sort of that, I don't know, blissful ignorance to show up again?
I am sure that there are many people that are operating accessory dwelling units today that are unaware that it's not allowed. And that may, to some degree, continue, but we have and we will continue to put out public notices and make the public aware that we are here to assist them. If this is something that is existing, we're encouraging them to come forward now. They get a 2-year get-out-of-jail-free card where getting them registered, ensuring that that one portion is owner-occupied, and ensuring that the parking issue is addressed. Those are the things I think that would have the biggest impact on the neighborhood. Similar to whenever we amend an ordinance to limit a use or expand a use, there's a learning curve for our community, but we're a little big town. We talk in this town, and we'll continue to put out those public notices as needed.
Okay, thank you. Karen, sorry about that.
That's all right. Thank you. The question that I have is about the addressing and like mailboxes and utilities. There's nothing in this ordinance that would say you have to have a separate utility hookup or that kind of thing?
Yeah, per public works standards, we don't want them to have separate hookups. So that actually helps promote the owner occupancy and ensuring that there's one owner who's taking care of and kind of residing on the property. So they won't have separate utility hookups. They will be required to have separate address numbers, and that will be important for the post office as well as any emergency services that are needed at that address.
Okay, so if somebody's having a heart attack in your basement, excuse me, and you don't know it, there's not a sign on the door that says this is a separate entrance, and you don't have separate entrances?
Well, so say you'll have Unit A or the regular address, and then I'm not sure what the standards are, whether there'll be half units or Unit A, Unit B, but they will be required to be separated out. That way, if the fire department is responding to a call, they'll know whether they're at the primary structure or the secondary unit. And that's one reason, too, that the registration helps with alerting emergency services of where these units are located in the community as well, so they'll know where those are.
Okay, and the mailboxes, they have to have separate mail receptacle?
Mm-hmm.
So they'd have 2 mailboxes out in the front of the street. So your neighbors would know if there's a separate rental unit on that property just by looking at the mailboxes.
That's similar to
Mr.
how the
Chair.
neighbors do there.
So there may be some that get their mail delivered to a door slot. There may be some that are currently have a mail bank at the end of the street. There's not a lot of, well, there are no new subdivisions today that have mailboxes. So it's just the older ones. They will have separate addresses. I'm sure that however the property is getting their mail today would be expanded for that second address. I can't say that they wouldn't just share a mailbox. I don't know how that's not something that we regulate. That would be with the post office. So we can't tell you that it would have 2 mailboxes.
I'll just jump in here, having gone through it recently. I will tell you that the post office will require something separate, and it will be not something that you predict. and you'll just have to deal with it. Sorry.
That's all right, thank you.
Tim, maybe you could follow up on the emergency services part?
Sure, thank you. We certainly support the aspect of the ADUs overall. I think it's probably a better option than a lot of the current rental situations we have throughout the city. The response with the addressing is probably going to be a, XYZ A unit or B unit will work for us versus half pieces, but we certainly, we don't see any major issues with locating those from an emergency standpoint, provided we have the addressing in place appropriately. Kind of taking a little sidebar, I always talk about fire sprinkler protection. That's something we talked about in this early on, but we don't have the latitude to be able to enforce that at this point because of the state law that's in place on a single family dwelling, which these probably fall into that category. So we're comfortable with the ordinance as presented, or the proposal as presented. We've had a lot of discussions with that and certainly support its approval.
Thank you. Any other question? Oh, sorry, Karen.
That's all right. I just want to state that I've struggled with this ordinance over the whole time, and you folks have done a lot of work and made changes and tried to accommodate everything that's going forward. I see the need for like college kids that need a small place to stay, and I think that would be a benefit to them. I suppose there are some families who want their mother-in-law in a separate place. That I could see. Not all of us would care about that, but some people might. And so I can see some of those issues. When it comes down to whether I can support or not support this ordinance, I really struggle with that, mainly because to me, a single-family home is a single-family home. And it's something that I would never rent out my house. It's my house. And I have a tough time thinking about this as it's a commercial entity, I guess, that I'm going to rent out part of my abode for gain. And that part I struggle with. If it was not in the single-family zoning place, I'd feel more comfortable with it, but that's exactly what this is aimed for. And I guess I still am struggling. If there was a way we could do a sample, trial area or something to see if that would work, would make me feel more comfortable about supporting it. But at this point, I don't know that we want to go through a conditional use permit, but if there's some way that the neighbors could at least know that this was happening, I'd feel better about it. I know there's places in town that there's somebody that is renting out their basement, and the neighbors do not like it. And if they even knew about it, they probably still would not like it, but at least they would be aware of it, I think. And so that's part of the part that I struggle with, too. So just so you know, when I vote, if I vote no, that's the reasons why.
Vicki?
So one of the major changes that we brought forward after having listened to you and council in the public hearings, the original document had exceptions that could be reviewed by the director. And as a part of this, the location, the size, the entrance, the address, the occupancy, the residential characteristics, the height, it's all written in there. And some have criticized that it's too strict, that it's going to make it difficult for everyone to be able to do this because it's got to line up. In addition to all of that, we've written it so that if you don't line up on everything, it's a variance brought before the Zoning Board of Adjustment, so that you folks sitting on the zoning board, if they can't meet all of their criteria that have been proposed in order to mitigate any nuisances, then have the opportunity to say this does make sense in this situation or it doesn't. And my concern with noting that there's an existing ADU and the neighbors don't like it, is it just the aspect that there's one there, or what's the reasoning? Because that's the whole reason why it's difficult to do these as a conditional use permit. If your neighbor likes you, you can do it. If your neighbor doesn't like you, then potentially it's not supported and it can't be done. And that's difficult to create regulations that way. If there was additional criteria that we were reviewing as a part of a CUP, that makes sense, but we've tried to make this defined in what will work that we've included the criteria that we typically would for a conditional use permit.
Thanks, Vicki. Rachel?
I always respect what Karen says because she has so much, background and history and knowledge, and it's every time she talks, I just want to listen and understand. But I do want to ask staff. So currently, any house in Rapid City could they rent out a room or a portion of their house to people without any oversight from the city? So any house in Rapid City currently could be renting out to other people who aren't a part of their nuclear family. And the only difference this makes is that a separate dwelling, which is smaller than that house, can be used for that purpose instead of, say, like a spare bedroom. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair?
Vicki?
When you have someone, whether you're renting out a room or they're just spending the night with you, they're a part of your family. You're sharing the kitchen, the living area. In this case, it's a separate dwelling unit with separate sleeping, eating, and sanitary facilities. That's the primary difference.
Any other questions or comments on this? Vince, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Somebody asked me the other day if I dye my hair, and I don't, and I'm getting older. And I'm going to look distinguished like some of these other guys up here someday. I know that's going to happen. My point being is that, I've seen other people who have, as they get older, they do not want to move. They do not want to get out of that house. My mother was one of those. It would have been great to have, also because of the fact that prices tended to increase, she didn't have any additional income. It would have been nice if she had one of these ADUs where she could have rented out to help pay the bills. And believe me, it would have helped everybody. This was well thought out. It does limit so that there are rules, there are that we all have to follow, and it does make it a point of record so we know where everyone is. So in case of emergency services, I think it's an improvement. Yes, we'd like to have the sprinkler systems installed, but we can also look at the fact that that if we do this, we're not servicing just ourselves, we're servicing the future. And as I say, as we grow older and we don't want to move out of our house, if we had an ADU where we can help with the bills, and that's probably my primary concern right now, is that this ADU is a great project. I'd like to make sure that that it's understood that we're not trying to take over someone's home. We're not trying to eliminate their independence. I think it's an improvement, and that's one of the reasons why I am voting for this.
Thanks, Vince. Mike Kwasny?
Something that, thank you for your compliment of we're aging. I'll take it as a compliment. What makes it an ADU then? You're telling, what I'm hearing is that I can take and rent out my bedroom. At the point that I put a kitchen, a stove downstairs, that makes it an ADU? I guess I'm struggling a little bit with what makes it an ADU versus my house that I rented out part of it and I chose to put a microwave downstairs. I struggle with that a little bit still.
Vicki?
So you've got a separation between the units, whether that's a door that locks or doesn't lock or a wall, and a separate entrance. An accessory dwelling unit has a separate entrance than the main structure. So they will function. One family will come and go without having to walk through the living room to let the other family know, hey, we're going out to dinner. That's, if you were, my basement as an example, if I put one wall up, my basement would function as an accessory dwelling unit. Separate entrance, separate parking, and it would work. I have guests right now, but they troop through the living room to, ask me to join them. There lies the difference. They'll function as two residences on one property versus just renting out your bedroom.
Can a sheet be a wall? I still struggle. I just find myself struggling with exactly what it is I struggle with.
Can I interject? If I'm not mistaken, in building code, you can't put a second stove in a house, right? Isn't that the delineation? I can do a bar area with a sink and a microwave and a refrigerator, but the minute it has a stove, isn't that the second kitchen that is not allowed in a house?
I can't answer that question. I know years ago you couldn't have a second kitchen, but with everyone doing expansive, elaborate family rooms, I believe that code has been changed. And I don't know if it's the stove part or the sink part. I don't know.
Gotcha. Okay.
Mr. Chair, if I might.
Vicki, yeah.
So, John brought up a comment about covenant, and that right now the city's not a party to the covenant. Courts would challenge that we don't have any authority on that covenant. It's between the association and the property owner. If the city were involved, there would probably be instances where those who were opposing the ADU wouldn't like the position that perhaps the city took on interpreting that code. When we're not a party to it, that's separate litigation. We similarly see that when a property owner leases land to a communication facility, and that lease says that communication facility owns that piece of property, and then they decide they're going to sublease to another communication, and the property owner runs in and says, don't let them do it. I'm not signing that conditional use permit application to expand that tower because I'm not getting any revenue. Our position has been, we deal with the property owner and we let them deal with the agreement they have with that communication facility in a civil court of law. And that's worked well. Having said that, we acknowledge that for many, many years, any new subdivision that has come in has covenant that is submitted with it. And most of them, if not all of them, preclude renting out for commercial gain or monetary gain any portion of your home or property. They're ensuring that they continue to function as a single-family residence. Karen, you may even have that on your property. So you're right. When you're in that neighborhood and it seems difficult to picture someone down the street with an ADU, and it's a subdivision that's occurred in the last 20-plus years, it's probably not going to be allowed. And if this were something that did happen and we had complaints, let's say it's the subdivision that John is in and he's on the association board, and he calls and says, hey, did you guys just issue an ADU for this property? And we said yes. When that next guy comes in, we're going to be noticing them that check with your association. Don't put financial improvements into your property when they could shut that down. And that's conversations we have every day. Someone comes in for an oversized garage. We've learned that there are some subdivisions that don't allow oversized garages. Even if we are proving it through a conditional use permit, or in one case, Zoning Board of Adjustment granted a variance to reduce a setback. That property owner was going to build, and the association knocked on the door and said, if you do, we'll sue. And he said, never mind, I'm not doing the permit. So we do acknowledge they exist. We do share any information that we can. We just do not have the authority to enforce, and if we interpret, we may upset one party or the other, so it's not always in their favor. At this point, I guess, knowing that these are, with all the criteria set forth, with those properties that would not be limited due to covenant, it's really a fairly small portion of our community that can even consider this. And many of them, like me and Karen, would never think to put a second dwelling on our property. we've had a lot of people join us at public meetings that have heard about this online, that call us continually, that are waiting for this regulation to come forward because this is going to change their life. And it does open up availabilities. So as we've done with other ordinances, if this is adopted and we see 6 months from now that we've got a hole in the system, we will bring forward an ordinance amendment to fix that hole. Here, a couple of years ago, the Planning Commission and the Council approved creating an urban commercial district. Since then, we've got a grocery list of little tweaks, and you're going to be seeing that in the near future. Once created, these documents stay living, and it's our jobs as your city staff to ensure that when we become aware of issues, we bring forward amendments, and we will do that with this one as well if we have missed something.
Thanks, Vicki. Don't have any more lights up, so is anybody ready to make a motion?
Motion to approve.
All right. Vince made the motion to approve item number 8, the accessory, let me make sure I call it right, the accessory dwelling unit ordinance amendment. And Rachel seconded that motion. Any discussion on the motion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed?
No.
Let's do a roll call, Andrea.
Braun,
Yes.
Bowman, Caesar, Gallagher, Herr, Hogestradt, Quasny, Ottenbacher. I have 5-3. Motion passes.
All right. Kelly, I think you're up.
Good morning. If you recall, back in June, city staff, well, actually let me start over. Back in January, we asked Planning Commission to support a comprehensive plan amendment. We brought forward that comprehensive plan amendment in June, and it was actually effective last month. So again, one of the recommendations in the comprehensive plan is to periodically review future land use and other things. And so we've got another little laundry list of changes we need to make. So we're here today to ask you to sponsor another comprehensive plan amendment.
All right. Karen's ready to make a motion to sponsor another comprehensive plan amendment or future land use amendment?
Yep, it'll be mostly, as of right now, we have about 10 to 12 future land use changes. We will be notifying the property owners. Most of them are already all aware of it because this is either because of a rezone that's already happened or developer driven. And then we do have a couple where we noticed just some tweaks where there was some mistakes made originally.
Okay. Mike Quasny seconded that motion. Any discussion on the motion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Any other items today? Planning Commission, staff, otherwise? Look for a motion to adjourn then. Galen made the motion to adjourn, and Rachel seconded that motion. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.